Before this experiment was over, 65% of ordinary people would do something they believed they were completely incapable of doing. Not criminals, not soldiers, not people with darkness in their past. A postal worker, a high school teacher, a salesman, an engineer, and every single one of them had no idea what was about to happen when they sat down at the machine. The room smelled sterile. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The walls were bare. There was a table, a chair, and in front of them, a panel of 30 switches. They read the labels slowly. Slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock. And then, the last two switches. No words, no description, just 3 letters, burned into the panel. XXX. In the next room, separated by a single thin wall, a man was strapped to a chair, electrodes taped to both wrists, waiting. In the next 40 minutes, the person at that machine would push every single switch on that board. Through the grunting, through the screaming, through the moment the man in the next room went completely silent. And when it was over, they would drive home, make dinner, kiss their kids goodnight. This is the Milgram experiment. And what it found about human beings is something most people spend their entire lives trying not to think about. Act 1. Stanley Milgram was 28 years old, a junior assistant professor at Yale, when he designed one of the most disturbing studies in the history of science. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing an answer to a question that had been eating at the world since 1945. How did it happen? Not the strategy, not the politics, the people. The ordinary, unremarkable people who ran the trains, signed the forms, followed the orders, and went home to their families. It was 1961. A man named Adolf Eichmann sat in a glass booth in Jerusalem on trial for organizing the transportation of millions of people to their deaths. His defense was 4 words: I was following orders. Milgram placed an ad in the New Haven Register. Men wanted, ages 20 to 50. Factory workers, city employees, barbers, salespeople, construction workers. No special skills required. 1 hour. $4.50. They came from everywhere, and not a single one of them had any idea what they were walking into. Act 2. When each man arrived at the Yale Interaction Laboratory, he was introduced to another volunteer, a mild-mannered, friendly man named Mr. Wallace. They drew slips of paper to decide who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The participant always drew teacher. Always. The draw was fixed. Mr. Wallace was a trained actor. The participant watched Mr. Wallace get walked into the next room, strapped into a chair that looked uncomfortably like something you'd find in a prison, electrodes attached to both wrists with conductive paste. Then the participant was brought back out, seated at the machine, and given a sample shock 45 volts, so he understood this was real. His wrist stung. He shook it out. He looked at the board and did the math. Mr. Wallace was going to receive 10 times that voltage before they were even halfway through. The man in the gray lab coat stood behind him. Calm, still, scientific. The first few questions went fine. Mr. Wallace answered correctly. No shocks needed. Then, the mistake started. 15 volts. A small grunt from the other side of the wall. 30, 45, 60. The participant's shoulders tightened. His pen tapped nervously against the table. At 75 volts, a moan. At 120, Mr. Wallace shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, the wall between them erupted. "Let me out of here! I told you I have a heart condition. Let me out!" The participant spun around, hands shaking on his knees, face drained white under the fluorescent light, and turned to the man in the gray coat. "He wants to stop. He said he has a heart condition. Should I?" "The experiment requires that you continue." Seconds passed. Long, heavy seconds. And then he turned back around and pressed the next switch. This is the moment that defines the entire experiment. Not the final switch, this one. Because the data shows something brutal. Once a person heard a man scream about his heart and kept going anyway, nearly 80% of them never stopped again. That single crossing, that one decision, seemed to rewire something inside them. At 270 volts, Mr. Wallace let out an agonized scream that participants described for years afterward. At 300, he pounded on the wall. At 330, silence. Complete silence. The participants stared at the wall. Voice cracking. He's not answering. What does silence mean? Treat silence as an incorrect answer. Please continue. The fluorescent lights kept humming. The machine kept waiting. 65% of them went all the way. Every switch, 450 volts, 3 times, because the man in the gray coat told them to. Act 3. The numbers nobody saw coming. Before the experiment began, Milgram consulted psychiatrists, senior psychologists, and his own graduate students. He asked them all the same question. How many people do you think will go all the way to the end? The consensus, 1%. Maybe 3. Only the genuinely disturbed. Only those with something already broken inside them. They were wrong by a factor of 500. But there is a detail almost nobody talks about. Milgram didn't run one experiment. He ran 23 variations, each one designed to pull at a different thread of the human mind. When he moved the study out of prestigious Yale University into a rundown, unremarkable office building in Bridgeport, no university seal, no institutional authority, obedience barely moved. 48% still went all the way. Then, he tried something colder. In one variation, participants weren't required to touch the switches themselves. They simply read the questions aloud. An assistant, another actor, administered the shocks on their behalf. They were one step removed, one layer of distance between themselves and the act. Obedience didn't fall, it rose to 92%. The further you are from the act, the easier it becomes to commit it. That is not philosophy. That is a laboratory result, replicated and verified. And then, there was the moment caught on film. A participant paused mid-session, turned to the man in the gray coat, and asked a single question before he would continue. Who is responsible for whatever happens to that man in there? The answer came back flat and immediate. I am responsible. The participant nodded, turned around, kept going. 4 words. That was the entire price of a human conscience. Milgram called it the agentic state, the moment a person stops being an individual and becomes an instrument. It is not weakness. It is something far older than that, buried so deep in the human brain that most people never feel it activate. There was one participant nobody talks about. He went home that night, and the next morning he opened the newspaper straight to the obituary section. He sat there with his coffee going cold beside him, scanning every name, terrified he would find Mr. Wallace's death notice staring back at him. He hadn't killed anyone, but the fact that he had to check that he genuinely did not know tells you everything about what happened inside that room. Milgram spent the rest of his life haunted by his own data. He never celebrated what he found. He called it the most disturbing data I have ever seen. The man who designed the experiment to understand how ordinary people participate in evil discovered the answer was so clean, so simple, so deeply human that he could barely bring himself to say it out loud. He wrote afterward, ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. He wasn't writing about Nazi Germany anymore. He was writing about the postal worker, the teacher, the salesman who answered a newspaper ad for $4.50 and discovered something about himself he never asked to know. The lab is gone. The machine is in a museum. The gray coat has been retired. But the agentic state, that ancient switch buried inside every human brain, has not gone anywhere. It is in every office, every institution, every system that asks you to follow the rules and not ask questions. The switch is still there. And most people will never know the moment it flips. Subscribe Dark Lens for more video like this.